If you are watching this, congratulations. We have made it through Lists Like Woe for the year, and we are finally at my best of the best books I read in 2022. This is theoretically a top 10, but this year I had to go to a top 11. And then also, it's kind of a cheat because two of the entries had multiple books in a series, so I just grouped them together. But you know, whatever, okay? I read a lot of books. I'm not sure how many I will have read in 2022. Okay, I'll put the number here of the number of books that were eligible to have been on this list, but it's gotta be between 250 and 300. So it's hard to pick out of all of that, what is the best of the best? And this video is my attempt to do that. So before we get started, I do want to note that the HarperCollins union strike is still ongoing. I honestly, when I was originally filming these, because I have to film them a little bit early, I assumed that the strike would be over by now. As of this filming, it is not. Creator that I'm in the same group chat with reached out to the union and asked how they wanted us to handle end of the year lists. And they asked that if we were going to include books from HarperCollins in it, that we would also just mention the strike that is going on. I highly encourage you to go sign their open letter. You can follow them at HCP Union, see the full array of everything they've got going on. So I highly encourage you to do that. And if the strike is over, I guess I'll just edit this part out. Hopefully it will be, because it's been like a month and they've not heard anything, which is kind of crazy. I assumed that this would be over by now, so I didn't even think about it with some of my other videos. But anyway, so today we are talking about the top 10, top 11, whatever. And before I get to that list, I want to give you a few stats. So this is Editing Mara popping in because I think when I was going over these stats, I hadn't finished compiling them, so the way I was talking about them was a little awkward. So I'm gonna pop in here and give you the full skinny now that I have calculated everything. Also, my cat is demanding attention right now, so if you hear meows, that is what that is. So in terms of my stats for the best of the best this year, so starting with genre, I think the most notable thing here is that this is the first time in a while where I've not had romance or something that I'm primarily categorizing as romance in this top list in a while. A couple of these have romantic components or are fantasy romance, but they're primarily fantasy, so that's how I classified it. So yeah, so we've got a lot of fantasy this year. This was just a really good year of sci-fi fantasy reading for me. So that is definitely the dominant category, followed by mystery. Nonfiction always makes a good appearance because that's usually a pretty strong category for me, and a little bit of lit fic. Then I've started tracking a few key demographic areas over the last few years to kind of have a comparison year over year, which is what we'll end with. But for this year's list, dominated as usual by women, I had a decent showing from men, and neither is what I use for non-binary authors or if there's, mixed gender authorship. So yeah, this is pretty typical for me. This is a big switch from where I was a few years ago, where I was mostly reading and liking books by men. It's kind of the opposite now. So that's for this year's list. Then I also track race/ethnicity. So this year, mostly white authors, but also a good representation here from Asian authors and authors with a Latin ethnicity of some kind. Nation of origin for authors. Unsurprisingly, I'm an American, so I tend to read a lot of things that are from America, and I'm a English speaker, so I mostly read things from primarily English-speaking countries, but a little bit of rep from people from the UK, Russia, and Australia on here. And then in terms of LGBTQIA plus representation, a little bit more than a third of the books had that in terms of the author or the main character. Health diversity-wise, that's what I use for books that are bi or main character is got some kind of health diversity, so in terms of like mental health, physical health, etc. Mostly not represented here. And then the last thing I always measure, and I didn't even bother making a graph for this because, it was just a full circle, is straight up alive or dead, because theoretically I want to be reading from people from the past as well. And this year that did not even crack the top 10. All of the authors are still with us. So that's this year's stats. And then looking to year over year, we have it's interesting because if you look at my overall reading stats for the year, which we'll get into in a different video, more than half, I think I'm at like 55% of the books I read are by or about people who are not like me in some meaningful way. And these are some of the criteria that I use to determine that. And I feel like year over year for my top list, that's not improving, even though I'm reading more diversely. I don't know. Anyway, I just think it's interesting if you look at how this is going year over year. Not quite what I would have expected. So I think that's interesting. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is the percentage of books that were eligible to make this top list. So in terms of the number of books that were eligible to make the list, there were 286 books I read between December 1st, 2021 and November 30th, 2022. Of those, 11.89% were either 4.5 or 5 star. That was 34 of the 286 books I read. So basically rounding up, that's like 12-ish% either got a favorite of the year or an all-time favorite, because that is how I define a 4.5 and a 5 star respectively. And then only 2.1% got a 5 star. So 6 books out of the 286 books I read, I gave 5 stars to. So I think overall having it be a little bit more than 10% is pretty good for a favorite of the year. And I definitely had, I believe, I would need to go back and confirm this, but it feels like, and I think the numbers bear this out, that I had a lot more 4.5 star books this year than I did in previous years. So with that, let's go back to the original filming, since I now have these stats fully calculated and can talk about them more articulately than I was in this original filming. So the other thing I want to do before I get to my top 10 is I do like to give a shout out to all of the 4.5 stars that did not make the list. It's tough competition out here to get on this list, and I do still like to represent the other 4.5 stars. So let's do that. Let me get my piles of books to show you. Okay, I think I've rounded up all of the physical copies I have of my 4.5 stars. So I've got Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is high fantasy. You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akweke Emezi, which is a literary romance. Bad Fat Black Girl by Cecily Bowen, which is a memoir with a lot of like sociological stuff incorporated. Hood Feminism, which is a sociological work with a lot of memoir elements incorporated. Go Hex Yourself by Jessica Clare, which is a paranormal romance. Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, which is sci-fi literary short stories. Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri, which is a high fantasy with a strong romantic element. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is science fantasy, maybe would be the genre here. The Haunting of Maddie Clare by Simone St. James, which is maybe paranormal thriller is the right genre here. Paranormal historical thriller. Pretty Dead Queens by Alexa Dunn, which is a YA mystery thriller. Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurlan, which is a serial killer thriller. Shiver by Ali Reynolds, which is a isolated closed circle mystery thriller. The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy A. Brown, which is a sociological economic book, maybe is the nonfiction type here. Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison, which is a science nonfiction book. Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is a classic. Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood, which is contemporary romance. Book Lovers by Emily Henry, which is romance, contemporary romance, verging to more general fiction. That's all the ones I have physically. Let's double check the ones that I do not have physically. I know that I have I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy as audio. Empire of Pain by Patrick Keefe, which is a biography of a family. I had that as audio. Oh, and then, hold please, I forgot one other physical one. S by J.J. Abrams and Doug Dorst. So those are all the 4.5s that are not going to get discussed anywhere else on my top list. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. And maybe the way to do this is trying to mix it up every year. Let me pitch who I think would like these books rather than trying to justify why I put them here, because even when I'm looking at this, I'm like, I should change this around. Like, I don't, on a different day, this could be ranked differently. A couple of the ones that were 4.5 could have come in here. I don't know, but we'll just do like a, who I think would like this. So number 11 is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I think that you would like this if you like historical fantasy that is kind of Dickensian. So it reads kind of like a Victorian 3-volume novel. So it feels like a very Victorian mannered style. And thematically, this is about colonialism, racism, particularly against Asian people, but writ large. And I think also if you have previously read the Poppy War trilogy, if you know that you like R.F. Kuang's character development, then I think she does character development very similarly in this as she does in the previous books. And for me, I love that. So it really, really works for me. I don't think if you like her character development, you will like this book. This was the one, it wasn't in the top 10, and I was like, this doesn't feel like a complete top list for me if I don't include this, because this does feel like a top book for me of the year. So that's why we had to do top 11, because I just couldn't leave it out. Oh, and I should mention, if you want my full thoughts on these books, go watch top 10 genre lists. Okay, and then 10 is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This was the beginning of my love affair with T. Kingfisher this year. And I think that this is a book for if you like something that has a dark fairy tale plot and quality meshed with like a cozy buddy road trip book. This is a fantasy that has two very different tones in it. And I think that that combination doesn't work for everyone. For me, it is yummy, delicious candy, and I love it. So I think that that's who I would pitch this to, though, is somebody who's down for kind of a odd tonal combination that feels like it shouldn't work, but in my opinion, totally does. This is number 10, and T. Kingfisher. I just finished my third book from her last night, and I can officially say she is a new favorite author. Then I would say The Woman in the Library by Sulari Gentle. This is a mystery that I would pitch to somebody who likes meta books, so books that sort of have fourth wall breaking and kind of are playing with the form of a novel. This is a book within a book, so if you like that. If you like a mystery that's not super kind of grim or cynical in its tone, this has a romantic component that I don't know is wholly successful, but I do think adds some levity to the book. So if you're not into like super dark, serious tone in your mystery, I think this would work. And if you are into kind of having the dual stories of book within book, for me, this is basically like hitting a tone and using unconventional literary devices that really works for me. So this is a reversed locker room mystery that if you think any of those things sound appealing, I think is worth at least giving a try. Then number 8 is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. And the tagline, I think, really pitches this best. It says, a novel of high fantasy and low stakes. So if you love the idea of cozy fantasy, think kind of in between regrouping of your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, like when they come back to Ye Dungeons and Dragons town and are like restocking and like you're going around meeting the people of the town. If you like that vibe and you're into found family and starting over and just like cozy loveliness, getting invested in these characters, very character driven fantasy, this is totally worth giving a try. Maybe one of the most like the loveliest books I read this year, of just like, this is just a delight. Also, Thimble. If you know, you know. Number 7 is Never Coming Home by Kate Williams. This is YA mystery thriller that is for people who like the idea of a retelling of And Then There Were None. This is for people who are okay with really violent YA, or it's really between YA and adult. So like if you're down with the idea of violent YA or very young protagonists in an adult, I think that's kind of the tone. The pitch for this is And Then There Were None meets Fire Festival. So it's influencers who've been, invited to this island and then someone's trying to kill them. So sort of like ritualized serial killer thriller. I think if you're okay with it not being a complete one-to-one retelling and having some variation in how the author is interpreting the original text it's drawing from, I think this is one of the best And Then There Were None retellings I've ever read. Okay, number 6 is Ruby Fever by Ilona Andrews. And I'm actually gonna tell you that if you have not read the books before this, I am not pitching this to you. So let me pitch you the original. Like, I think you should start with Burn for Me. So let me pitch Burn for Me, because this is the final book in the second trilogy in an overall series. So going back to the first book of the first trilogy, this is for people who are into what I would probably call urban fantasy, sci-fi romance. Mystery plot engines. Ilona Andrews, all their books have speculative element, a strong romantic subplot, and a mystery plot engine. So in this world, it's for people who like the idea of kind of superhero powers that are genetically engineered, but end up working a lot like magic or magic powers. So it's technically science, but it reads sort of like fantasy. It's this family who have flown under the radar with their powers, but are kind of coming into the attention of the larger magic-y world because of some shenanigans they get into. They run a detective agency, so that's kind of how they get pulled into things, as people are hiring them to look into things having to do with the political machinations of that world. And it has a really good romantic element in it as well. So if you like a romance thrown in with all of that, this is a great series. I think this is the best series that Ilona Andrews has ever written. And this particular one, I think, was a very satisfying conclusion, both to the second trilogy and to a lot of the things that we'd been kind of wondering about in all of the books to date. So it leaves a door for another trilogy with Arabella and finishes what we know of the story really well for now. And I just realized that that's technically my top, I guess, 4.5 star. Well, no, that's the highest 4.5 star that's standing alone on this list. So we're entering 5-star territory. So number 5 is Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is a 5-star memoir. This is written by the Emily Doe and the Brock Turner essay case that was famous about 7 or 8 years ago now. And the reason it became so notorious was because of the laughably light sentence that POS got, but also because of the incredible victim impact statement that Emily Doe at the time and is now known as Chanel Miller gave that went viral. And it is an incredibly emotional read. So this is a book for when you are okay with crying. This is a book that will make you mad at systemic injustice and the way that the criminal justice system isn't really, it's just not, it doesn't center the victims, and it systemically privileges certain people over others. So if you're ready to be mad about that, if you're ready to laugh, because I think that she has a very wry sense of humor that is incorporated throughout in this in a way that's really surprising. And I think if you just value beautiful writing, I think aside from the very compelling subject matter, her writing itself, she was an English major, and you can tell because she is just a really wonderful communicator. So if all of those things sound appealing to you in a memoir, I would recommend this. Check out the content warnings and make sure you're in the right headspace because it's a lot. Number 4 is Moonflower Murders, but I'm also popping in Magpie Murders because this is the second book in a series, and I read both of these this year. This was a 4.5, so I guess, like I said, technically maybe this is the highest 4.5. Moonflower Murders, it is definitely a 5-star. It's one of my favorite mysteries I've ever read, and this I think is a very worthy book. I would pitch this to people who like meta elements in their mysteries, so it is a book within a book. It is a pastiche of Agatha Christie, though I would not recommend this if you're expecting the writing to be similar to Agatha Christie. The book within the book has a detective character named Atticus Pound, who is very clearly kind of a pastiche of Poirot or a take on Poirot. So it is not the writing of Agatha Christie, but it is that golden age of detective fiction kind of mystery story, the book within the book. And then the framing book also has a lot of those classic whodunit elements. I think if you're somebody who likes something like Midsummer Murders or ITV's Poirot, like if you like a whodunit and you like the idea of having both a contemporary setting and a historical setting, or like historical, the 1950s-ish, think that, mid-century, then I would definitely recommend these because they are super well executed versions of what they are. So that is number 4. Number 3 is Her Body and Other Parties. And I do want to mention that I also gave 4.5 stars to this author's memoir this year. So this is like I don't know. I love this book too. In a different mood or a different list, this certainly could have come up. But anyway, I've read both of the books that this author has published, Carmen Maria Machado. I love them both. She needs to give me more. She reminds me a lot of how I feel about Roxane Gay. So if that's a comp title in terms of just beautiful literary short stories that are incredibly insightful, really reflecting on the human condition. And I just love her the experimental part of her writing. So that's true both in The Dream House. I think I would describe that as an experimental form for memoir. And this definitely has experimental short stories, which I personally love. They do not work for everyone, but I don't dislike any of the stories in this collection, which is very rare. And what takes this kind of to the next level for me is how they all tie together thematically. So if you like a short story collection with experimental short stories and that have sort of a unifying theme, in this case, I think a lot about feminism and sort of like bodily autonomy for women. If you're down with those things and you're also into the idea of having like an 80-page story that are just absurdist episode descriptions of Law & Order SVU episodes, this is a book for you. I think that this is definitely worth trying. You may not like it, but I think that it's good enough that I would recommend anyone try it if they're at all interested in this kind of thing. So love this. One of the best short story collections I've ever read, and hurrah for the experimental, inventive verve of Carmen Maria Machado and all of her writing that I've encountered so far. Okay, number 2 is How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman. And this may not be for everyone. For me, this really was like a milestone book and kind of crystallized my journey out of evangelicalism and into question mark, but just like really reevaluating or re-looking at some of the topics that I grew up being very indoctrinated with from a totally different angle was wonderful. If you like histories of religion, if you're into sort of like a different look at a historical figure that recontextualizes them, if you're into philosophy or biblical studies, I think that this is completely very approachable versions of all of those kinds of nonfiction. So if those are topics that are of interest to you, I definitely recommend this. If you don't want to do a full book of this, but you kind of are interested in dipping your toes in the water, I also recommend this author, Bart Ehrman, has recently started a podcast called Misquoting Jesus that so far has been very interesting and approachable, and that is up on YouTube as well as Spotify or whatever. So this is number 2 because of what it did for me this year. Yeah, not sure that this is one for a lot of people, but it's definitely one for me. And then number 1 by a country mile is The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. And I'm also putting The Golden Fool in here because this was the other 5-star in the Realm of the Elderling series that I read this year. You cannot start with The Mad Ship, which is the second book in the Live Ship Traders. So this is the second book in the second trilogy in this overall series. This is the second book in the third trilogy in this overall series. So you cannot start with either of these. So I have a fuller discussion in my SFF Best of the Year list about where I think you can start. But let me just say in general who I think The Realm of the Elderlings is for. It's for people who really value high quality writing in their fantasy. I would say at this point, I'm pretty comfortable saying that Robin Hobb is the best writer. Like, her writing is the highest quality of anything I've ever read in high fantasy or epic fantasy. It is for people who enjoy a very character-driven, slow burn kind of approach to both plot and the world building. This is for people who like the idea of a long series where you increasingly understand what was happening in earlier books the further you get into the series. So it's not that the original trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, it's not that you can't enjoy that in and of itself, but you will retrospectively enjoy that series so much more the further you get into the overall series. This is also a series for people who love multi-layered themes in their fantasies. So for instance, Live Ship, I think, is a lot about different responses from women to patriarchal structures, as well as sort of the overall corrosive or corrupting force of slavery. I think Tawny Man is a lot about generational trauma and repeated cycles within families and within societies. I think the Rain Wild Chronicles is a lot about women's reproductive health and choices. So there's really, these are the kind of books you could write full-on theses about. Like, there is a lot happening in these. And then it's somehow very cozy. Like, it reminds me of that like old, like 90s Tamora Pierce kind of world and vibe. And yet it is as, if I just were to sit here to tell you some of the things that happen in this book, it's as grimdark as something like a Joe Abercrombie. So while it has this beautiful writing and this kind of, at times, coziness to it, it's also savage AF. Like, it is, Robin Hobb does not care about your feelings, basically. So if you're cool with crying, if you're cool with, like, I think her really letting the implications of her scenarios play out without regard to the reader, then I think that this is a series for you. And like I said, this is definitely a 5-star. This is one of the best books I've ever read. One of my all-time favorite books, but this has been at the top of the list since the beginning of the year and nothing has unseated it. This is one, like, I would need to go back and really rethink about my top 10 books ever, but this is definitely in contention for being a top 10 book of all time for me. The Mad Ship is a perfect fantasy novel, in my opinion, and I am obsessed with the Live Ship Traders series itself, and this is just unquestionably the best thing I read this year. So that does it for Lists Like Whoa for 2022. Those are all of the best books, or my favorite books that I read in 2022. Let me know what you thought about this top 10 list. Were there any surprises? I'm guessing The Mad Ship was not a surprise if you're a watcher of the channel, but were there any surprises, things that you think should have made the list that didn't? Let me know what some of your top books of 2022 are. Did you have a clear favorite the way I did, or a few that you're in contention with? Let me know all of that in the comments below. And yeah, I think that will do it for me. I hope that you have a very happy new year. Great 2023 to you and yours. And yeah, that will do it for me. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you're having an absolutely lovely day today. I hope you're having a wonderful new year, and I will just talk to you guys again soon. Bye!